Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the No Name Cinema Society, the film review show that dares to dig just a little bit deeper. Tonight we're starting our 59th series of episodes, which will be our final series of episodes for this, our 5th season. And we're doing it in style with our annual review of a Star Wars movie. We've got the Rise of Skywalker for discussion for tonight. And hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler. I am back at Astoria, Queens, so fans of the show will recognize this particular environment that I'm in. I'm usually here for the holidays, which reminds me, Merry Christmas to you all. Yesterday was, of course, Christmas Day, and also we're in the middle of Hanukkah, so for those that celebrate that, Happy Hanukkah, awesome. Including our own society member, Devin Michaels. Happy Hanukkah to you as well, sir. Speaking of society members, it is time for me to introduce my co-host for the evening. First, my own Padawan who's eager to speak tonight, Jedi in training, Alex Evans is here.
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year.
And our other co-host, of course, is a Sith Lord back from the dead. Jim Carroll is here.
Happy belated Saturnalia. I hope all of your pagan festivities went well.
All right, so let me talk about the schedule for this, our 59 series episode, starting tonight, December the 26th, with Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. On Monday will be our Indie Spotlight. December 30th, we'll have Devin and a new society member to review the indie film from 2009, Downloading Nancy. And a week from tonight, in the new year, January 2nd, 2020, will be our classic movie discussion of the film Double Indemnity, celebrating its 75th anniversary in 2019. And next Monday, January 6th, will be our 43rd Sound Off. I'll have Alex back, in which I'm going to do a book review. Alex is going to do a second run, and I've been tasked with counting down my top 5 Billy Wilder films of all time in honor of our review of Double Indemnity. I've got some fun facts to lay on you all, because a couple things happen with our review of this movie. By reviewing this movie now, both Oscar Isaac and Carrie Fisher break ties to rise to becoming the male and female actors that we reviewed the most on this show. This will be the 6th film that we reviewed that featured Oscar Isaac, and the 5th film that we reviewed that featured Carrie Fisher. Of course, the Star Wars films are a big chunk of that. So if you take out the sequels, it's a little different. Then Robert De Niro would lead the men, having 5 films that we reviewed, and Julianne Moore would lead the women with 4, including 2 that Jim was on, Suburbicon and Single Man. Other non-Star Wars movies that we reviewed for Oscar Isaac, we reviewed Drive in episode 36.2. We reviewed The Promise, episode 39.1, and Suburbicon, episode 43.1, I think that was. And other movies that we reviewed that feature Carrie Fisher include Hannah and Her Sisters, which I think was episode 5, I think, and Shampoo in episode 17.3. All right, guys, that's a little fun facts for the audience as Oscar Isaac and Carrie Fisher break some records here. These guys don't drink, at least not on the show very often, but I am. I've got Modelo here. It was in the fridge, so I'm stealing it, and I'm going to drink it to celebrate tonight. So, again, Merry Christmas to everybody. Thanks for watching. This is our 5th season, and I'm excited to talk about Star Wars with you guys.
I'm also excited to talk about Star Wars.
I bet you are. All right, so I've got a summary. You guys ready?
I'm ready.
The Rise of Skywalker scroll begins with the phrase, "The dead speak." The voice of the late Emperor Palpatine is heard throughout the galaxy somehow, so both the Resistance and the First Order scatter spies to see if they can discover the source of the broadcast. Meanwhile, the First Order has a mole in their midst who's been feeding the Allies enough information to help keep them from being completely eviscerated. Guys, how was that summary?
I mean, I feel like the movie really helps you a lot with your summary.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I basically gave a shortened version of the scroll. Yeah. It's all about a taste. All right, it's opening thoughts, and I'm going to go to my Padawan here. First, one sentence, Alex, how did you feel about Rise of Skywalker?
I thought it was the best of the 3 Disney Skywalker films.
Okay, Jim.
I thought it was all icing and no cake.
Okay, we'll dig into that. And I also liked it better than the last 2. I agree with Alex, believe it or not, but I still pretty much hated it. So that's where we are for tonight's broadcast. They were a little more vague than I was. I'm going to resounding thumbs down, as I have been since we reviewed Last Jedi 2 years ago and The Force Awakens, and I've been thumbs down all the way down. So I don't really have a lot good to say about the movie, like maybe little bits in each element. What would you guys? I'll let you guys take the wheel for a second. What would you guys want to start with if you were talking about one of the better things about the movie? What worked best for you guys? Any particular element? Whether we usually do performances, direction, or screenplay? Like, what do you guys have in terms of what worked best? And then we'll go from there. Nothing. Don't forget, we're also on Spotify, guys.
I appreciated the return to even more practical effects. And I thought there was a lot of really solid practical effects work done by all the creature team on this film.
Okay, and I hadn't really thought of that at all. It didn't bump for me. But that brings us to direction. In that category, I would say a lot of these choices were mostly off for me. But one thing that I did think worked pretty well was the score. And they brought back the master, John Williams. And I have to say that probably is what worked best for me. I think Williams did a nice job of balancing new music and incorporating the familiar themes that tap nicely into our subconscious. And in fairness to Abrams, director J.J. Abrams, he did seem to know in the edit just where to bring back the old music that strike an emotional chord, if you will. And I don't think it was a bit overdone, and that could have been a thing for this movie. So, Jim, anything on the score?
The score is great. And it definitely, you caught so many of those callbacks to the earlier films, especially the scene in the old Death Star. I guess the new old Death Star.
To the audience, I just want to say we're going to try and be as spoiler-free as we can.
Yeah.
Any spoilers that we give is going to be something that you get in the first few minutes or so. Alex, score.
I enjoyed it. I'm glad they had John Williams on board. I feel like it does give you that visceral reaction to remembering the old movies, which is both good and bad in this film, in that it's like, oh, I really liked those. And then it's like, oh, this isn't those.
I hear you. Now, staying in the world of post, the other thing I want to talk about was editing. And overall, I would say, the movie was way too long. Not that there was a story issue of it being too long. I actually felt shots were lingered on a lot, as if waiting for an audience reaction almost. We don't see that phenomenon too much, maybe in Avengers Endgame, which we reviewed in episode 54.1. I also missed the wipes, guys. They did it occasionally, but not nearly as much as the original films. And they seem to have gone more and more away from it. And the wipes in the old films transitioned us between the various running storylines they had going, usually 3 or 4 at a time. In that sense, the film lacked balance in all their storylines, where the original 3 seemed to, balance nicely between whether it was Luke and Dagobah or what Han and Leia were doing and what Darth Vader was doing. This one was much more heavily, skewered towards one storyline and occasionally going to the others. And I feel like the balance, they talk about the balance in the Force, there was a lack of balance in the editing, I felt. Alex?
I thought they kind of bridged that with some shared narrative devices that were used in the other 2 films of this trilogy that did not exist within the rest of the franchise. Having characters speak to each other in real time across different storylines.
I was willing to go along with that a little bit, but they went to that well an awful lot.
The rules of it were really unestablished.
I'm going to get into that when we talk about screenplay, I think. But Jim, editing?
A lot of what you're talking about with the shots lingering, I think it goes to a larger problem of a lot of the movie felt like it was a 2-hour goodbye.
It's funny, that's almost what we said about Avengers Endgame.
You had to give every minor character who ever appeared in a Star Wars franchise just a little bit of airtime for the audience to pick up on, oh, that's that person.
That also comes back to a larger screenplay issue, which I think we'll get to later. I want to talk about camera movement for a second, guys, because another thing that I think contributed to the length was the reliance on camera movement, which often seemed arbitrary to me. The choice to track from one character to another or around characters, and sometimes, and it didn't feel motivated by anything that was going on in the narrative. Furthermore, it took too long. And I felt like, to let the shot finish, I mean. And I felt like the actors had to wait an unnatural amount of beats to finish their moments because they're waiting for the camera to hit its darn mark. Just reverse shot that stuff and move on, guys. Anything on the camera movement or any sort of camera-related stuff?
Similar to all 3 films since Disney took over, that they don't have enough faith in their own story.
I get that.
It's just like floating all over the place. And you're like, oh, people will be so wowed by the great camera work. And it's like, no, we all see what you're doing.
I'm sticking with the direction and sort of those sort of choices. One of the people I saw it with mentioned the color palette. They really liked it. And I thought it looked fine, but I also thought it was fairly basic and a little on the nose. Lights and whites where the Resistance are concerned, darks and reds for the First Order, and kind of boring. And I didn't like The Last Jedi, but I did think it was more visually interesting, like Luke's Island, and also like the red beneath the salt in that final battle. It seemed to be more in-depth thinking involved in some of the color scheme than in this film.
We have a vocabulary around Star Wars where we know that red is Sith, greens and blues are Jedi. I did
There's
think
a large element to design to all these other worlds that they take us to. Like,
there's some really beautiful set pieces. I don't think there was anything like the Battle of Crate, which was the white salt and red underneath that you were talking about. I don't think anything was up to that level. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty and it's interesting in that you get all these worldscapes, but it wasn't as much as the Last Jedi. I agree with you there.
Alex.
I felt like it was trying really hard to feel like both a young adult novel and a video game at the same time.
It's funny. There's a lot of video game thing was what a lot of people said about the prequels, which I get. But it's interesting that you bring in the young adult aspect. I hadn't thought about that, and that is an interesting.
I really like the color palette. There's a planet where there's a cultural event going on that's very colorful. I thought that looked pretty cool.
I forgot about that. You're right.
And
that one scene felt like Tatooine, like during Mardi Gras. It had the elements of Tatooine, and then the colors sort of forced into it. Go ahead, Jim. You want to say something?
This also is a larger problem with Star Wars. Is this one in particular, where you have so many planets that they go to in a very short amount of time? At a certain level, it always seems to be, oh, look, it's another desert planet like Jakku or Tatooine, or it's another water planet.
Why aren't there any suburb planets?
You're not wrong. The last thing about direction, and all these behind-the-scenes stuff that I want to talk about is to segue to performances. As far as performances are concerned, J.J. Abrams, to me, it sounds like was no help to these actors. Oh, on the whole, I think the performances in this movie are pretty bad, which in fairness was a hallmark of some of the original Star Wars movies, so that's fine. Adam Driver continues to be my least favorite actor. I think he's terrible, and I can't wait till the scenes in this movie are over. In any movie, let alone this one.
I am also not on the Adam Driver train. I do not understand why people think that he's a good actor. He's the same person in every single movie.
The louder and whinier version in the Star Wars movies. I got a couple performances that I thought were pretty good. But before I get to that, guys, how do you feel about my overall statement that, in general, performances in this movie are pretty weak?
They seemed really confused, like they were being pulled in a lot of directions.
Yeah.
They were not given clear direction. They were probably changing the sides on the day for as big of a thing and fast of a moving thing as a movie like this.
Or possibly even like feeding them information a little bit at a time. Even if they weren't changing them, it's all shrouded in secrecy. So they were keeping stuff from them. And so it was hard for them to build characters because they didn't understand where they come from or where they'd been. Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I felt like a lot of the subtext of the actors was, I'm here for my paycheck. I think the level of frustration, especially on John Boyega, on Oscar Isaac, on Daisy Ridley, I think that you could actually see the frustration come through in their performance in places where they were just not happy. That goes to unclear character development, a conflicting storyline, changes in position from the last two films and where they were going. I mean, there's a whole litany of things that these actors, I think, were saddled with in trying to do a continuation of the first film, and let's forget that the second film happened. And
Daisy Ridley has no reason to be unhappy, quite frankly, because this trilogy made her. So if she was, that, I judge her for that. She wouldn't be anywhere without this. She was cast as an unknown. Go ahead, Alex.
She had to watch 3 Star Wars movies with Daisy Ridley in them. Even if you're her, that might bum you out.
Fair enough, but I mean, I think the opportunity, will pay off for her in the long run. It'll give her more opportunities. You mentioned Oscar Isaac, but I think he's one of the 2 performances that I think managed to form something, particularly more this film than previous films. As this trilogy stand-in for Han Solo, I think he has just the right mix of humor, pathos, cockiness, and quite frankly, naivete. The mutiny in the last film was stupid, but he played it well. And this film adds to his backstory, and I doubt that he had that information in the other 2 movies, but he wove it in seamlessly into his character without ever seeming like a totally different guy. Even though we didn't get information on why he was more interesting, complex in the other films, we still got the sense through his performance, whereas Finn and Rey carried lots of baggage that we were aware of, and yet their performance didn't resonate at all through their acting choices. So, Jim, I liked Oscar Isaac.
I'm not saying he did a bad job. I'm just saying you could see the level of frustration.
I didn't necessarily see that, but I mean, I wouldn't blame them. Alex.
I kind of forgot that he existed by the time the credits rolled.
Interesting. All right. Well, that doesn't bode well for his performance. The other performance that I really liked harkens back to a previous episode. In episode 45.4, it was the sound off. I counted down the top 5 Star Wars performances of all time, and my number 1 was very controversial because I chose Ian McDiarmid in Revenge of the Sith. And here we have the return of Ian McDiarmid. I feel like he's so compelling as all different incarnations of Palpatine. His dialogue is frequently silly, but he grounded it, and so he made his character's mania and lust for power believable. Somewhere along the line, McDiarmid decided to make this character very self-aware of who he was and what he could be, and he didn't apologize about it. The combination of unbridled power and unbridled arrogance is truly frightening, and while extreme, it still tracks for me. He's a great villain, I think. It's a good kind of over-the-top kind of acting, which is opposite of what he does in Revenge of the Sith, in which he's a little more sly and scheming, dancing around the shadows. I think it's a tremendous feat every time he steps into Palpatine's shoes. He doesn't have a lot to do in this movie, but what he does is compelling to me.
To go back to what you're saying is the right kind of over the top. I think you compare that with somebody like poor Domo Gleason with
the wrong kind of over the top. Yeah,
is just this flat, totally one note, just angry guy.
Richard E. Grant too.
It's the character's as thick as a piece of paper, and Palpatine, yeah, I mean, Ian McDiarmid embraces that evil and is like, this is just who this guy is. But there's definitely you still feel that there are gears and mechanisms working deeper and underneath all of that.
Yeah, Alex.
I've enjoyed him in all the Star Wars films he's been in, and I think he captures the character well and showing that he's kind of a chameleon in how he presents himself in different situations.
Cool. All right. So it sounds like you agree.
Yeah.
Cool. Now let's get to the real bugaboo of this movie. And I keep hinting that we're going to come at it. And so let's talk about the screenplay. And the largest issue I have with this film and the whole trilogy relates to the phrase I call wholeness of world. And you guys have already intimated it a little bit. And I may have mentioned that same phrase in previous reviews of the trilogy, Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. These new films, to me, do not seem to operate within the world that I knew and understood. The screenwriters make changes for their own convenience and not out of anything organic, and that's sloppy and lazy to me. For example, Jedi powers, to me, are pretty well defined and understood by the time we get to Episode 7. However, if they're going to evolve somehow, then that needs to be established. It sucks that you as a screenwriter can't define your own rules, but this is the sandbox that you're in right now, so color between the lines to intentionally mix a metaphor. They didn't do that. They just changed the rules of the world because it made things easier for them down the line. There were so many things in this movie that happened that I just outright rejected. You can't change the rules. Jedi powers was a big thing, but there's constantly stuff that are like, that's not this universe. That's why Rogue One to me was so much more successful. That felt like a Star Wars universe I recognized.
Yeah.
It really felt like this script was written from the standpoint of everybody who comes to this film will have already watched all of the episodes of The Mandalorian that are out.
Okay, I've not watched any. I'm sure Jim watched them all.
Yeah, there are certain Jedi powers and things like that they introduce within that series that made some of the new things that came out in this film less abrupt, but it was still like outside source material that not everybody would have had the time or resources to go see. Even
if they introduced it in The Mandalorian, unless they introduced the how it evolved to that point, like. It tracked.
They don't.
Lightning out. Okay, yeah, it's still part of the same issue. Lightning coming out of her hands, for example, I bought that given some of the twists and turns that came out later. Some other things, I'm like, that's not something we've ever seen before. I didn't buy it. And Luke, Jim, you've seen The Mandalorian. What do you think?
First of all, thank you. Second of all, I mean, even within The Mandalorian, it doesn't, the power differences don't track. I mean, The Mandalorian is a completely different story and it has a completely different angle on this. So I don't think it necessarily should track, but I think you're right in saying that it breaks established world building rules. I think the trilogy as a whole is very sloppy in its world building.
Yeah.
Especially when you're handed something with such 40 plus years of history and
detail. There's a lot of detail. It was Deus Ex Machina stuff. They needed to do something, and so they introduced these new powers or new things to make things easier for them as screenwriters. That's why I use the word lazy. I think you used the word sloppy, Jim.
Yeah, those very people who love this material so much, it's not going to be an extra sensibility of, oh my God, that's so cool. They're going to go into that and see these scenes and say, what the heck is that?
I agree.
you can't suddenly shift these rules that we have established for so long.
I mean, they talk a little about this thing called a dyad.
It's a musical
flimsy to me. I know that, but I mean, like they talk about it in the movie. I think using that to justify some of the things that I think Alex was asking about. It's a little flimsy, and it also seems convenient.
Forgive me if I'm wrong here, but it's thrown in the last 10 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
This is the issue. That's my segue to the next bit here, which is plot holes. Part and parcel, I think, the whole is a world. My theory on the approach to this script is that they had several moments that they wanted to capture and then set about trying to string those moments together with a plot, independent of whether it made sense or not. The original trilogy seems to have planned a lot of its twists and turns in advance. So things were hinted at in episodes 4 and 5 before things were revealed in 6. And that's because there was one voice behind it. These three films feel disjointed with one another with all the different creative auspices between the three. For example, as much as they tried to explain it, I never bought The Return of Palpatine. I'm like, I don't know, guys. This doesn't track for me. And why are there so many uncharted systems in these three films? Their tech is so advanced, except for everything but cartography and geography with these guys. There's a moment towards the end, too, that got a huge boo from the audience at 34th Street, understandably so. And Jim's smiling as if he knows what that is. This movie, I kept thinking about Deus Ex Machina. The writers were constantly pulling stuff out of their asses to get them out of corners, which made for another frustrating viewing experience for me. Jim?
I was having this discussion after the movie. I went to see it with a friend of mine.
Wait a minute, you have other friends?
I pay them a monthly stipend to be my friend.
That makes more sense. That tracks. See, anyway. That's established now. You see, I wouldn't have bought that if I saw that in a movie, but now you talk about the monthly stipend, it all makes sense.
Exactly.
You and JB are a dyad in cinema.
Jim, you were saying you were discussing this.
So, I completely agree with you in that Lucas, for whatever changes were made between 4 and 6 for the original trilogy, he had a diagram. He had written out 1 through 6.
Written out 1 through 9, but they rejected 7 through 9.
But he had an idea to follow. And the prequels, the story's easy. All you have to do is write the story to get to 4. 7, 8, 9, it felt like there was no story. There was J.J. Abrams saying, here's a bunch of little mysteries that you guys can tackle in the rest. Follow this trail of breadcrumbs. Rian Johnson came in and was like, forget that, I'm doing my own thing. J.J. Abrams is like, well, now I have to answer all of my questions. By the way, here's Palpatine because reasons. Palpatine is in there to give us an immediate hook as a bad guy so that we can forget the state of where we left the last movie, which was desperate and bad.
I was going to say just dumb.
George Lucas is a filmmaker that thought in terms of creating worlds that are actually lived in and put that into everything, even within the prequels. Like some of it might not have been executed the best way, but even if something was done poorly, it was executed in an innovative way that was interesting. On these films, J.J. Abrams is a TV showrunner more than a filmmaker in my estimation. And one of the big games of being a TV show creator is that you need to create enough mystery to protect your job for as many seasons as possible. They're like, okay, we just need to make it good for 5 seasons to get syndicated. Okay, Star Wars is already syndicated. It's really big. How do I just keep people to keep showing up to the theater and buying toys? Not how do I tie this story together? And he might not have consciously thought of it that way, but there is kind of this slick con man aspect to being a TV showrunner, more than a filmmaker.
I think they were writing it from the outside in is how I like to say it, meaning that they had a result that they wanted and then worked backwards to try and figure out how to get there instead of coming up with something organic. I think the obvious place to have started this trilogy was with a republic back in place, peace and prosperity, with empire-like system sort of rising.
If the First Order had been the rebellious element within a New Republic world.
Yes, exactly. I think that would have been much more compelling and also realistic, because where did the First Order come from? We blew up everything in Return of the Jedi. Where did they come from? Nowhere.
We've got new designs. Who's funding it?
Exactly. I've got so many questions.
That was actually my issue with this third film too, is the size and the resources needed for this new army.
Palpatine's rich, man. Anyway, I'm going to move on because we're so long. Moving on to the T word, ladies and gentlemen, so we can talk about some of the themes of this film. And the reason this film appealed to me a little more than the others, meaning 7 and 8, is that it did seem to have a modicum of depth, a little more than the previous 2. To me, legacy, generational legacy, was a big theme. And it seemed to be concerned with that and its relationship with destiny. We have the ability to write or rewrite our own histories in spite of our heritage or our environment, those two elements that supposedly define us. But we have a choice, and more often than not, it takes courage to break free from that path, the path that previous generations have predestined for us. And this isn't just about the Jedi characters. You see it with Poe, Finn, C-3PO to some degree, and many other tertiary characters, breaking free of their past and what's supposed to define them so they can decide for themselves who they really are and what they represent. So that's something I took from this movie that I thought was kind of surprisingly interesting.
Sure. I feel the theme for this movie was nostalgia.
It wasn't a theme within the diegesis itself. You're talking about an outside money-making theme for Disney.
Kind of. Feel like nostalgia was the theme so that people could gloss over the many gaps in the story.
I would rather think that J.J. Abrams and company just made mistakes instead of like purposely doing that. But Alex, do you have anything on this generational legacy thing and this concept that we make our own destiny?
Yeah, that seemed to be what the focus of, and it felt very masturbatory.
Alex says it's unanastic, and so both of you seem to have this concept that there's something coming from the outside in sort of shaping this thing, which I mentioned earlier, but I had one other theme that I wanted to pitch to you guys, and I'm going to call it a call to arms, in a matter of speaking. And this one reminded me a little bit of Endgame, which Alex was on the review of that, me, Alex, and James. And I talked a little bit about this then. I saw the second part of this movie as a call to action for the larger populace to stand up to the bullies of our current world, presumably Trump, Putin, Kim Jong-un. Only together can we prevent these power-hungry world leaders from extending their reach and influence. So now films that have this message, they do fail to me to explore the nationalist dissatisfaction, the pain of some of the people, justified or not, that led to the rise of figures like Hitler, Trump, and Putin. In that sense, I feel like this theme is a little one-sided and broad in the film, but I do think it's there. It was exciting. I just wish that if you're going to approach that, then you're also going to approach or suggest how the empire may have risen in that scenario. So guys, call to action.
Historically, and it's something George Lucas explored in all the films, is that I think the natural evolution of republicanism is that it will eventually devolve into imperialism that will eventually grow so large it tears itself apart. And that's kind of what Return of the Jedi is. Out of that comes synapticalism. A lot of the extended universe stories of the 90s were dealing with those synapticalist themes.
Yeah, and you talk about, I think, the Timothy Zahn books, right? Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising.
Yeah, and even Shadows of the Empire and other things like that. There's not really a clear-cut ideology to the resistance of, is their goal to bring back the Republic, and why aren't they the new Republic Army?
Yeah.
It just made no sense. Why is this other group the authority?
So many questions about just the trilogy in general, really, and none of them really lived up to explain or fix those things. From a creative point of view, it was a failed enterprise. I think from the time they jettisoned George Lucas. Jim, anything on this call to action?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alex. I think that call to action is going back to episode 4.
But it has a particular resonance in obviously they didn't know the impeachment was happening when they were making this film, but it has a particular resonance, I feel like, at this current place and time in the world, don't you think?
I mean, yes. There is an individual standing up against an oppressive authoritarian regime is a theme throughout all of Star Wars.
And cinema history, but it doesn't hurt to be reminded. I'm not saying it's a fresh idea or new. I mean, there's a lot of film. We talked about Endgame covering something similar.
Yeah, I think that our current events happen to be providing this narrative overlay.
The word you're going to use is coincidence. It sounds like that's the word you're dancing around.
I mean, yes, it's coincidence. It's our times that are giving us an additional reading, not anything that Star Wars had to work at.
I disagree to some degree, at least for the final 20 minutes. I do think that they had this in mind.
I thought I semi-enjoyed this film until we had this discussion.
Here's the thing. In the moment, as you're tracking along, it's fine. And the minute that you stop and think about anything, it completely
I went into this film with the least amount of hope, the least amount of excitement. Like even for 7 and 8, I had that excitement walking to the theater, and that when the logo comes up at the beginning of the screen and comes towards the camera, like I got chills. Nothing here, not a moment of awe in The Rise of Skywalker for me. You guys?
No. Yeah. I was more excited in Attack of the Clones.
Me too. I mean, there's great moments of awe in Attack of the Clones. I think. All right, guys, I don't have time for closing thoughts, unfortunately. As you can see on the clock here, we got to go. All right, so this is the last current feature we're doing. We've got a couple episodes coming up. Of course, Next up, this upcoming Monday, December 30th, is our Indie Spotlight. I'll be back in LA, in which I'm going to have Devin, a new society member. We're continuing to review indies from 2009, and it's going to be the film Downloading Nancy, starring Maria Bello, and that'll be our Indie Spotlight this upcoming Monday. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.